So it's time to do some myth busting with regards to that household analogy that we get from this traditional theory of money. In that traditional view, money is a scarce commodity, and like households or anyone else, for the government to spend money, it must first acquire that money. It can get that money through taxes or from borrowing. Borrowing the money could be good or bad, depending on whether you're hawkish or dovish, and on whether you're in favor of what the spending is for or not. But from an alternative modern money theory perspective, money is a completely different thing. Money is a generally accepted IOU. Taxes ensure that the government's currency will be generally accepted. I'll accept the government's currency in exchange for goods and services that I sell to the government because I know the government will only accept those dollars in payment of taxes. But in any case, spending has to happen first, which is to say, before taxes can be collected, the government has to spend money. And before bonds can be issued, the government has to spend money. This, of course, makes perfect sense once we accept that the federal government is the only legal source of dollars. Anyone else creating dollars would be counterfeiting, although banks create something that is practically the same thing as dollars through loans. The federal government only accepts dollars then in payment of taxes, which begs the question then, how could you pay your taxes if the government had never spent? Of course you couldn't. If the government hadn't first spent money, then there would be no dollars in existence, so no one would have dollars to pay their taxes. What does this then suggest about government deficits? Popular opinion suggests that deficits today will require the government run surpluses tomorrow to pay off that debt. But the MMT, the modern money theory view, would suggest that really the government must run the deficits today if it wants to run surpluses tomorrow. In fact, the government would have to run deficits greater than surpluses in general, otherwise there'd be no dollars left in the economy after tax day. And the same basic logic then applies to when the government issues treasury bonds and sells them to banks, what we usually treat as the government borrowing money. And in fact, this really can't be the government borrowing money to finance government spending because the government would have to have spent the money beforehand to create the dollars that the banks then use to buy the bonds. What bonds actually do is they remove the liquidity from the banking system that results from deficit spending. When the government spends, it credits bank accounts, and when the government taxes, it debits those accounts. And this is all there really is to the creation and destruction of money. But a government deficit means an increase in the amount of money in the banking system as a whole. And then the question is, all else equal, what effect would you expect this to have on interest rates? And I'll give you a little hint here. As you've seen previously in the class, when banks in general have too much money, too much liquidity, they'll start trying to sweeten the deal when they go to ask other banks to borrow that liquidity. To convince somebody to borrow from you when they don't initially want to, you offer them a lower interest rate. So contrary to the standard neoclassical position, government deficits will not increase interest rates. They'll actually lower them, all else equal. Then bond issues are actually removing the money that's driving interest rates down to raise interest rates back up. And of course, if the Fed sees interest rates going too high, they simply buy some of the bonds back. And they do so with what? Dollars. But of course, inevitably, there's going to be some detractors who say this story can't possibly be true. Surely people won't just keep lending to the U.S. government if it's clearly spending irresponsibly. Eventually, domestic and foreign investors will lose confidence in the government's ability to repay the debts or expect the value of the dollar to be eroded by inflation. As a result, these bond vigilantes, many argue, are going to sell off their bonds, which is going to drive up interest rates. Then the government will no longer be able to borrow to finance its deficits, not at least without paying very high interest rates. As debt to GDP and deficit to GDP ratios increase, the interest rate burden of the national debt begins to get out of control, they say. Servicing the debts will then inevitably lead to inflation and ultimately government insolvency. And it's worth noting the kind of dovish version of this argument is that it's okay to run deficits when the cost of borrowing is low, that is when the interest rates on government bonds is low, but we should be careful not to borrow too much because that will eventually drive up interest rates. But the response from the MMT folks is, as you'll recall, deficits don't actually raise interest rates, they lower them, all else equal, and Even if everybody wants to sell bonds off all at once, which will cause interest rates to rise, the Fed can and will buy them to keep interest rates down. Fundamentally, then, the argument from the MMT side is that the government simply cannot be insolvent in its own currency. A treasury bond is really just an IOU where the federal government is the I and the bondholder is the U. What's the thing then that's owed? That's right. It's a dollar. When you purchase a treasury bond, you're really just accepting the government's promise to give you dollars in the future. And those dollars are really just the government's promise to give you what you already have then. Dollars. So it would be pretty silly to not want to hold treasury bonds because you think the promise won't be fulfilled. The government could never not be able to pay what they owe with these treasury bonds, because paying what they owe is really just swapping out the bond IOU for its dollar IOU, and since the government creates both of those IOUs, there's no constraint to their ability to make good on them. In reality, of course, financial markets and financial investors understand this. These bonds are treated as the only interest-bearing dollar-denominated asset that has effectively zero risk, and this is in fact why you see treasury bonds typically have very low interest rates, reflective of that very low, in fact zero, risk of defaults. So what we're arguing here then is a sovereign currency issuer like the United States is not really constrained financially like a household or a firm or a state government or what have you. The federal government doesn't need to get money before it can spend. In fact, quite the opposite. It needs to spend money before it could ever get money back from the economy. But to be sure, this doesn't mean that there aren't actually constraints on government spending. There are a number of them worth mentioning here. Probably first and foremost is the budgeting process itself, the politics and ideologies involved in actually passing the laws and executing the laws involved in government spending as well as taxation. If Congress doesn't want to pass a law to spend money on something, that is a constraint on the government's ability to spend money on that thing. Another basic constraint is the government could potentially spend too much, or it could spend on scarce or already employed resources, causing an increase in the price of those resources or a general inflation in the economy. Modern money theorists, as they're called, don't argue that government deficits don't ever cause inflation. They simply argue that government deficits don't necessarily cause inflation. And lastly, there are a number of self-imposed constraints on government spending that are worth mentioning. First, in the United States, we have debt ceilings. This is a unique and kind of silly type of self-imposed constraints by Congress in the U.S., in which Congress decides how much money it's going to spend and thereby how much debt it's going to create, and then comes back later to determine if it's going to pay that debt. Generally speaking, it would be silly to not pay that debt, and at least up until this point, we haven't seen a Congress that was, let's say, inept enough to not repay the debts. Another self-imposed constraint is debt denominated in foreign currencies. This would not apply to the U.S. national debt, which is all denominated in dollars, but some countries agree to take on a national debt that is denominated in another country's currency. And in that case, that government is like a household in the sense that they're going to have to get that currency to be able to repay that debt. Another self-imposed constraint is a currency peg. This is basically a policy that's designed to ensure that a nation's currency trades for a fixed exchange value with another currency. This substantially limits the country's ability to spend through the creation of its own currency. Gold standards are very similar to this. It's an agreement to maintain, in essence, the value of the currency in relation to a quantity of gold. And many argue that maintaining the value of a currency in relation to something like gold should be stabilizing because the quantity of gold is relatively fixed. But when you look at the actual historical record, what you see is it's actually destabilizing. Here you've got, going all the way back to the 1870s for the United States, the instability of the gold standard up until the abandonment of that standard in the 1930s. Those gray bars indicate recessions, and what you see is under the gold standard, recessions were much more frequent than when we got off of that standard.